Okay, today I would like to do a brief book review. I don't think this will take a whole hour. We'll see. I just got the book New Worlds Beyond the Atom. It's the Delaware book that Douglas Cottrell referred me to in the reading. And there's more to the whole thing than just this book. I found out a lot more after reading the book and looking up some of the things it referred to online. And anyway, so first of all, this book focuses on the research of George Delaware. I think it's, George. And for some reason, I think some of it's fairly apparent now that I've read the book, Douglas Cottrell singled him out to tell us more about this whole thing about cell vibration and affecting it with light, affecting it with sound. And at first I thought he was just kind of a solo researcher and that was why he was singled out. But it turns out there's an entire field called radionics. Now, if you look up radionics on Wikipedia or something, it seems like the overall public sentiment is that this stuff is all complete trash. But that's, of course, not uncommon. Because basically what we're dealing with here is a field that spills over into ESP and psychic phenomena. So it's right up there with Kirlian photography and the gas discharge visualization by Korotov and all this stuff. So that I guess relegates it to the realm of alternative science. So you can take it or leave it as you take or leave all that stuff. However, for those of us who are fans of these readings from these various sources, this has some unique importance because not only does it delve into extrasensory perception and psychic phenomena, more importantly, it deals with something that the readings say is very important to maintain health and a long life in living organisms. Again and again, the Paul Solomon source and Douglas Cottrell talk about this rate of vibration of the cell, of tissues, of the human body. And the basic idea is when the human body is sick, or if an organ is malfunctioning or something, that particular organ or the body, whatever, will have a different rate of vibration than it would if it was healthy. So that was kind of the level of understanding I got just from the Douglas Cottrell readings and the Paul Solomon readings. And they said that you could affect this with light, you could affect it with sound. In Paul Solomon's case, he of course recommended the PRE table because that was his device that source was really plugging basically. But all these things were supposed to be able to affect this rate of vibration. So at that point I thought, okay, well this rate of vibration must just be a frequency. So like a given cell will have a frequency. A given organ will have a frequency of vibration. And the body will have some frequency. And that seemed to be it. But there were all these tantalizing hints that you could treat specific organs and things with the PRE table by finding the right rate of vibration. He may have even said vibrational pattern or something, which would be closer akin to what I'm reading here. But so to make a long story short, Delaware went a lot farther in that area. And not just him. This entire field of radionics went and continues to go. Yes, it's still a living field, apparently. It continues to go much farther in exploring this entire realm of the rates of vibration of both animate and inanimate matter. And also, in so doing, it provides a lot of missing pieces to this puzzle of how the mind relates to matter, how the mind interacts with matter. And if you get into the metaphysics of Andrew Jackson Davis and Paul Solomon and things, there's this whole issue of how this never-ending energy that comes from God, who's like supposed to be the endless source of all power, wisdom, and love, how that never-ending energy gets translated into the material world, into creating material objects, and what role we play in that grand scheme of things. Because Andrew Jackson Davis, he goes over that in quite some detail, and sure, so does Paul Solomon. He talks a lot about how the mind is able to manipulate this kind of stream of energy and create with it. And Cottrell dwells on that a little bit in some of the readings I've heard, probably a lot more in some other readings I haven't heard, I assume. But that's basically the gist. However, you don't get any hard science, or at least harder science, than some statements like that. I guess Paul Solomon does go so far as to say the mind has the ability of adding charge to photons. Now, if you look this up in the literature, one of the basic definitions of a photon is that it can have no charge. But then there are some instances where photons can very briefly get a little bit of charge or something based upon this or that, or in the legit literature. But what Paul Solomon was saying is that when the mind imparts a charge to photons to the degree it does, those photons turn into matter. So they're no longer recognizable as photons. So I guess you'd be correct. A photon can't take on a charge because when it does, it becomes something else. But again, keep in mind, Paul Solomon was communicating in the terms of the people that would understand, and in the terms of the vocabulary that Paul Solomon had at the time. That was what the source was communicating with. So what I'm getting at here is I don't think we're necessarily dealing with photons. I think, as Andrew Jackson Davis points out, there's an entire spectrum of more and more refined matter and energy and quantized energy. And photons are probably on the relatively coarse or crude end of that spectrum. Of course, though, being much finer than just atoms and ions and things. And it seems like what we're dealing with is something possibly more refined than photons, but related. Still a lot of unknowns, even after reading the book. But I'm getting ahead of myself, as always. So the book is entitled New Worlds Beyond the Atom. And it's not beyond the atom in the sense that, necessarily in the sense that we're talking about quantum mechanics or subatomic physics, particle physics, whatever. But then again, maybe it sort of is. Keep in mind, one thing this book keeps bantering about over and over again is the materialist mindset we have in modern science. Now, the book claims that the materialist mindset in modern science was at a peak in the Victorian era, and it has been in a decline ever since, like after the discovery of the theory of relativity and things like that. However, growing up as a scientist in the late 90s and 2000s, early 2000s, I was very much immersed in a culture that is still basically 100% materialistic oriented. And what does that mean? Well, that means that the dogma of modern science, modern biology, is basically that all biological processes can be explained simply in terms of biomolecular interactions that are simply determined by the laws of chemistry. So basically you have the affinity of molecules for one another, parts of molecules for other parts of other molecules, based upon the electrostatic charge, basically the distribution of electron density around different parts of the molecule, gives you kind of a characteristic set of interactions it can have and characteristics of creating hydration shells and vortices and areas of electrostatic potential that can bring in other molecules and things. And of course I'm referring to enzymes that are really active and stuff like that. They seem to be magic almost. And the more we look into it from a materialist point of view, the more we find that it all can be explained in these terms of these simple rules. If you just understand the basics behind chemistry and how it works, you can start to understand how an entire protein molecule works. And that protein could be an enzyme and how that enzyme functions. And then you can start to understand how the entire functioning of the cell is governed by these simple interactions and these simple rules based on chemistry. And so the picture that gets painted to the student of modern biology and chemistry and biochemistry and things, the picture that gets painted is one where it's entirely materialistic. And heck, you look up the cell in Encyclopedia Britannica, and what do you get? You get an explanation that says the cell is nothing but a immensely complex, continuously unfolding chain of chemical reactions. And the assumption is that everything you see there can be explained in terms of chemical reactions. And I think this mindset really got solidified again once we discovered the molecular structure of DNA, how the genes were encoded in DNA, how you went from gene to protein to function, simply based upon a mechanical genetic code that exists in the DNA molecule. And it's there. All that stuff is there. And in a way, it's not surprising. There's kind of two ways you can look at that. One way you can look at it is, well, sure, the deeper we look, the more detail we see. And presumably there's just an endless array of physical detail that you can see. The deeper and deeper you look, the more closely you look. And the more you deduce, the more science you do. Another way of looking at that is, the deeper we look, the more materialistic it becomes, simply because we have the power to create and our ability to kind of mold reality around us creates more and more of this arbitrarily and insanely complex detail the closer and deeper we look. Is that really happening? I don't know. Because an argument like that would be an argument that says 100,000 years ago, there were no such things as atoms and simple molecular interactions like that. It was all just more unrefined or more homogeneous energy fields interacting, and it was only until after we started to look that they started to kind of crystallize into more and more solidified forms of matter. That's probably just all bunk. At least I still can't accept something like that. I guess the way that I interpret this whole thing is that from a certain perspective, yes, this all can be explained in terms of the materialistic nuts and bolts building blocks kind of biology that is currently taught and currently held in the scientific literature. But there's another way of looking at this, and probably what we're really looking at, and apparently what we're really looking at, is the underpinnings behind this system. And it could very well be that as we get into subatomic physics and discover more and more phenomena and interactions that reach far beyond the confines of a single atom, but that still directly depend upon subatomic interactions and subatomic physics, it could be that the more we discover that, the more we will get a picture of these same types of phenomena and principles and interactions we're talking about now. However, Delawarr and Delawarr Laboratories was definitely not involved in subatomic physics per se. They had no apparatus or understanding or any claim of understanding of that branch of science in any detail. However, what they are looking at is something that is directly related to animate and inanimate matter, but definitely not part of this materialistic worldview. So they are looking at phenomena that transcend the simple nuts and bolts chemistry, interacting atoms, and distribution of charge around molecules, things like that. So, where to begin? And keep in mind, this is not something separate from what the readings are talking about. This actually is directly related to what the readings are talking about. And that, of course, was the most fascinating thing about it to me. And probably should be to most of us. And I think it's why the cultural source pointed this out to me. At least it all hangs together. It makes terrific sense. So, what's this book about? Unlike the Ross Peterson book, this has a very direct and straightforward table of contents that does tell you what exactly those chapters we're dealing with, so we can pretty much go through them. First one is just, first chapter says, how much does science know, and it's just kind of an overview of the context. And by the way, this was written in 1956, and the particular book I got was republished in 1973 by EP Publishing Limited in Yorkshire, England. So I guess there was a subsequent publishing of it. And I'm not sure if you can get this on Amazon. I think on Amazon you can just get it used. That may be where I got it. I can't really remember. But still seems to be fairly easy to come by. And by the way, if I forget to mention it later, if you go to the, Radionics Society or Association homepage, I'll pull it up so I know exactly what I'm talking about. They have, I don't think you can get this book specifically, maybe you can, but they have basically all of the written works of De La Warr, as in all the research papers that he published and the journals they had going, and the De La Warr laboratories that continued even after he died, clear until 1987, still had some papers they were coming out with, and all of that can be obtained from this site, which hopefully I can pull up. There we go. The Radionic Association is www.radionic.co.uk, or just type in Radionic, that's RADIONIC, Association in Google, and you can pull it up fairly quickly. And they offer like certificates and education programs and things, and a whole bunch of services to kind of serve the radionics community. And basically radionics is, from what I can tell, is completely shunned in the United States, but in Europe and in the UK it has quite a decent following, and there's still lots of practitioners, and it's pretty much just another branch of alternative medicine in those areas. So, tremendous resource, and I'm just starting to tap into that. I'm sure I'll have lots more information for you on it later. So basically the first thing they get into here is sound and electricity. And De La Warr, when he first started working, was building upon the work of some other radionics researchers. He wasn't the first, so he had some things to go on. But some of the first things they discovered were the interaction of sound with living tissue. And I know I'm not going to explain this 100% right. I definitely need to go back and read the book again. Maybe if I have time to read it all through again before the Sunday weekly address coming up, maybe I'll give a more in-depth review of some of the science then. But basically, what they were doing in their first experiments was detecting, first of all, this rate of vibration of a living organism. And this is exactly what I asked Douglas Cottrell about. And I can tell why he recommended this book. I don't understand why he didn't beat me over the head with it even more, saying, look, there's way more in there than you could possibly imagine. Go look at it. Because my question from Douglas Cottrell was, how can I detect this rate of vibration in a cell? And I think one of my mistakes was being so specific. I said a specific cell. And he answered it in those terms when it's not really relevant. And I even understood it wasn't really relevant because when you're dealing with like a tissue or an organ, you're kind of concerned with that organ. And if you can find a vibrational rate that helps that organ, then you're golden. You don't really care what the particular one of every single cell in that organ was, with a particular vibrational rate. But being the materialist type scientist that I am, I, of course, am thinking from the ground up, the bottom up. But anyway, so they were dealing with particular people, and I think that was definitely one of the first things. You would take somebody that was suffering from a given malady, like tuberculosis, and what they would do is they would try to determine the rate of vibration of that person suffering from tuberculosis. And see, just from what I've read, it seems like they were taking that rate of vibration, broadcasting it back, and that would somehow treat tuberculosis. But that doesn't make sense to me. I believe what they have to have been doing, and when I go back and reread it, and maybe what they were doing, hopefully, is determining the rate of vibration of a healthy individual, of a healthy tissue, and broadcasting that. And they do talk about that a lot. So that definitely is what they were doing. And so the basic idea is you would have a rate of vibration for a healthy individual and a rate of vibration for someone suffering from a given disease. And then you broadcast this rate of vibration for the healthy individual, and it will then help the person very quickly overcome their disease. And that's what they found, that's how it works. And that's all well and good, but of primary interest to me was what was the nature of this rate of vibration and how did they find it? Okay, so the machine they had would basically generate frequencies. I believe it did it with sound, or it could be just electromagnetic radiation, like in radio waves or something. Not 100% sure there, I have to go back and check. But it definitely did involve sound at some point there, because it was like a sound generating device. And what they would do is they would work with resonance, and this matches exactly with what Douglas Cottrell was saying. To detect this rate of vibration, you can't just read it. You've got to set up another rate of vibration and see if the two match, and then keep moving the one that you're setting up until it matches the rate of vibration of what you're trying to detect. And that's exactly what they did with this machine. So they would basically sweep through a spectrum, a sound spectrum, and once they found a given frequency that was a match, that produced this resonance, they would know that that was part of the vibrational frequency of this tissue or this person. And they had a device where you basically turn a knob to sweep through the spectrum, and with your other hand you're touching this rubber plate. It's a rubber plate over a vacuum chamber or an air chamber, and they have the schematic diagram in the book. I don't know if that's like completely relevant, especially to start off with, but we can see if we find I think one of the first plates in here was a picture of that. The first one was the electromagnetic spectrum, which was kind of weird. So this was their first very simple device, just for the probe. I think was something you would like stick into a tomato or something you're trying to measure, or who knows what. This is before they had the machine with the dials and everything. But that's a diagram of the chamber with the rubber strip on top of it. And what the person would do is the operator that was using this machine would run their finger along, let's say this was the rubber plate, they run their finger along the rubber plate while they're turning a dial, okay? And when they got a match, when there was resonance between the frequency they were emitting with their little box and what the characteristic vibration of the person was, when those two matched, they would get what was called a stick. So it would apparently suddenly be harder to slide their finger across the rubber mat. And somebody who got relatively sensitive to determining this could very quickly then dial in a matching frequency. Now the key here was a question. It directly relates to a question I wanted to ask Douglas Cottrell but forgot. The key is that there's more than one frequency involved. Every person every tissue, etc., generates a chord, if you will. If you're schooled in music at all, you'll know what that means. A chord is two or more notes sounded together to produce a simultaneous harmony, basically. And not only is it a chord, it's apparently a consonant chord, at least in the case of healthy vibration, I would guess. And consonance and dissonance relates to just a very, very simple aspect of wave physics. And what the heck? The way that works is, let's say you're generating the simplest waveform, which would be like a sine wave like this. That would be just one tone, okay? Now, along with it, you could generate I'm trying to draw something that matches up, but I'm being very crude about it. The dotted line represents another tone that you could be playing at the same time. Now, if these two tones, if they lock, that means there are regular points at which they'll cross at a regular frequency. And that always happens when this other frequency you're playing is an integer multiple of the frequency that you started with. So if it's twice, then you'll get a nice lock, and that's called a consonance in music. If it's a multiple of 3, you get another one. That would be the interval of a fifth in music theory. If it's 4 times, that's another octave. If it's 5 times, that's the interval of a third in music theory, and so on and so forth. And every single interval that's known in tonal music theory, that's known as a consonance. And if you play electric guitar or something through distortion, it would be an interval that locks, and that lock is a very specific sound with distortion, and it creates a very rich and full and stable sounding tone that you can't get when you play a dissonance. All those consonances are basically integer multiples between two frequencies. And of course you can have more than 2, you can have 3, 4, 5, as many as you want. And the more you have, the more unique your chord is, because it's just a simple nature of mathematics. It's just complexity you're introducing. But you can have as many different frequencies playing as you want, and they can all be in perfect consonance if you're careful and you choose them correctly and generate them correctly. And when people sing in a chorus or something, they just naturally do this by ear. Their ear will tell them when things sound good together and they lock, and the chorus will naturally lock and tune up relative to itself. And extreme example of that would be like a barbershop quartet, where you have a small group of individuals that sing, if they're good, sing perfectly in tune, and they can get all kinds of locking intervals that aren't even possible with a piano keyboard, because you get into this, you find out that just spreading your frequencies across a simple piano keyboard the way it's done isn't adequate to encompass this entire tonal vocabulary of perfectly consonant intervals. But that's subject for a whole series of lectures in and of itself, I'm sure. I don't want to bore you to tears. But what's fascinating is these same exact principles that deal with music deal precisely with the nature of this vibration in living tissue and living and non-living matter, all matter basically, and all structures, all systems. So in this case, they're of course dealing with people with a pathology like somebody with tuberculosis. They would have a different set of frequencies, a different signature, a different chord. And it'd be interesting to look at. It could be that if you look at it, it would be a dissonance. There wouldn't be perfectly locking intervals any longer. I'm not sure. that would explain a few things if that's the case, because one of the things I was really wondering about is, here's Paul Solomon telling you to play Largo movements from the Baroque period over your PRE table, and you're supposed to get some kind of general health benefit. And I'm thinking, well, gee, if every single tissue and organ that's healthy has a specific signature, as in a very specific chord that you would have to play to resonate with it, well, what are the odds you're going to hit that exact chord in that exact key in whatever given piece of music you're playing? Well, it could very well be that you don't necessarily have to. What's probably just as important, or almost as important, could be the fact that you have consonants, the fact that you have locking intervals, chords that sound good together, notes that sound good together in harmony. That could be an important factor. So if that's the case, and just general consonants and tonality and good musical form and things just give you a general health benefit, then that would probably corroborate with the idea that a sickness or any kind of traumatic condition would result in a chord that was dissonant. There would be certain pitches or certain components of that composite rate of vibration that would not lock, would not sync up with the other ones, creating a dissonance. And if that's not something that comes straight from this book, they didn't really get into that kind of detail. It could be that some of de Loire's papers do get into that kind of detail, or some of the later radionics literature does. I don't know. I'll just have to get into it. But anyway, so what they would do is they would have a machine with a whole series of dials, so that they could isolate all of these. If you look at that picture, see that she's got her hand on the rubber pad there in the lower right-hand corner, and she's turning one of the dials. Yeah, that's a special one she's turning at the top, I think. It's a bigger dial, and what that was controlling was a bar magnet. They would basically have a bar magnet inside the apparatus to, well, they weren't sure what it does. My interpretation when I first read it was that what it was doing is canceling out the Earth's magnetic field line. So it wasn't something you could just set. You had to have a knob, and you had to tune it depending on where you were at and which direction you're facing and everything, or which direction the patient was facing or something. You would have to orient it so it would cancel out some interfering effect that the Earth's magnetic field apparently had. And they quickly stumbled on that because they found that sometimes they could get really clear results and sometimes they couldn't. And then they always could if they had this bar magnet oriented correctly for a given location. So each of the dials would be, each of the other ones in there would be for different frequencies. And so the procedure was you would find one frequency that was part of the rate of vibration, and then you would have that one set, and then you would go to another dial and try to find another one. And then, so they would find like 2 or 3 or 4 until they couldn't find any more. Usually it was just like 4 or something, I think, give or take one. And that would be the basically harmonic signature for that given condition or entity or whatever. And then they could just write that down. They could say, like, you know, the dial, the numbers, and they may have reflected, I think they were related directly to hertz. So you'd have a number like 64, 3, 2, and that would be a certain signature for a certain type of condition, which could be used in diagnosis, etc. And then, of course, you would have a combination for a healthy condition, and then you would set, the idea is you would set your dials for a healthy configuration for that condition, and then you would have like a sample of that person's tissue. If they weren't present, you could have like a blood sample or hair sample or something in one of the little chambers. I think it would be in that air chamber underneath the rubber pad, I'm not sure, and that's how they detect it in the first place. But anyway, so the idea was that would act as kind of a psychic link. You know, that was enough to tell your higher mind or whatever that that was the particular person you're aiming at, so to speak. And then no matter where that person was on the earth, they were able to transmit this treatment to the person. And of course, it had nothing to do with distance. There were no barriers of distance or anything. But this whole technique directly depended upon the people involved. So it depended upon the person sitting at the machine, and then it depended upon the characteristics, I guess, of other people sitting there. If you had people that were really negative and skeptical, it would interfere with it. This all relates. If you're familiar with anything related to ESP or psychic stuff, this directly relates to it. Even hypnotism. If you have people that are skeptical on things, it greatly interferes with the process. And if you study these readings from these various sources, they would have similar problems, and depending on other factors. So they isolated a number of those factors just through their various experiments in this book, and they kind of laid them out, what the whole process depended upon. And so that was basically the first part of their research in a nutshell. And when you put that together with what Douglas Cottrell is saying, it's just completely fascinating. So apparently they have a method. This was like in the 40s when they were doing this. They established a method to accurately detect the rate of vibration of any given tissue, any given person, any given type of matter, you name it. They were able to isolate its rate of vibration, its signature. It's not just a rate, it's like an entire harmonic signature of vibration for that entity. And that solves the problem. I mean, no wonder why you said, yeah, this could be done even now. They were already doing it, and there's people all over the earth all the time doing this in the field of radionics. So that looks like something that we can directly utilize to determine these rates of vibration. For instance, my current research project deals with aging worms. So if this theory is correct, that's being given us by these sources, if this whole theory about vibration being a large factor is correct, then you should be able to determine the rate of vibration of a young worm, and then take a really old worm that's about ready to keel over, determine its rate of vibration, and if you want, do a few intermediate steps or whatever. And you should have a couple of distinct signatures, harmonic signatures of vibration from this process that match up with youth and health, and then with malady and old age, or being decrepit and old age and things, having things going wrong, harmony, disharmony. And so then you should have a very specific harmonic signature that you could broadcast to these worms using your favorite medium of choice, I guess. See, I'll have to go back and read that. It's difficult to tell what medium they were using, because it almost seems like they're using a psychic medium. They did start out with just sound, I believe. So they were only using the psychic kind of thing to determine the rates of vibration. And what they're claiming is once they had the signature, you could just play the sound and it would have the beneficial effect. Now, if that's true, I believe that will directly relate to the materials of music, meaning you're going to get a lot less of an effect if you just take your harmonic signature, your chord, if you will, and just play it, like for 8 hours straight. Because probably what you're going to get happening is what's called in neuroscience is called, or psychology or whatever, is called alpha blocking. And that's where if you get a given stimulus that's repeated, the brain will just naturally start to block it out. And that apparently happens at the cell level too, when you're dealing with receiving frequencies of light and sound. And that's one of the reasons, or the reason, that Paul Solomon's PRE table has you play music through the vibrations instead of just having a vibrating table like your normal vibrating pad or whatever you'd get. Because any kind of simple oscillation or pattern of oscillations is going to be quickly adapted to by the tissues and cells, and then you'll lose the benefit. And I believe you probably run into the same kind of thing. Now, I don't think they really got to that level. They would basically just give a treatment, so basically broadcast the their harmonic signature for a few minutes, and even then they would get some therapeutic effect. But I would have to think that if this follows those same principles, what would be the best would be to incorporate that harmonic signature into a piece of tonal music, so it would reappear at different times throughout the your 5-minute song or however long it was. But it would also be incorporated into this kind of logical musical work that makes sense, meaning it you don't get bored while you listen to it. It feels like things naturally lead to each other, and it makes some kind of statement. And that's kind of a gut feeling thing that you run into when you're doing tonal music composition, that those types of composers will rely on, or songwriters, whatever. So I think I've got enough to start with, where maybe I can do this. Now, it's interesting that Douglas Cottrell was saying it's going to take at least 3 people to detect this. Now, granted, they did have several people involved. I mean, you'd have the person with the malady, you'd have the person running the machine, and then later on, when they were dealing with taking pictures with this, you would have a person developing the photographic plates and things, and it turned out that he was a critical part of the process as well. But and it seemed like Douglas Cottrell, in the reading for me, that's what he was at first just talking about. He was talking about just having a person with a pathology, having a person that was your scientist or whatever, or physician, and then having a conductor between them, which almost sounded like it could be a machine, like a device like this. So I'm not sure. I'll have to read up on this more, and my goal is to get as schooled as possible in whatever these people had established, and try to use that as a starting point, and see if I can accomplish something with it as a little side project in my own research. However, it sounds like to do it the way they did it, you need a machine like the ones they had, and apparently you can get modern day equivalents of these machines from that Radionics Association, and you can get them used online and stuff. So I don't know, maybe I'll be able to find one fairly cheap and or build one. Seems to be the way I end up doing things anyway. That I could use. So of course we'll try to keep you updated as we try those things out and see if we have any luck. But the book didn't stop there. That was just the beginning of the book, because this guy and his wife, and they basically had kind of a lab running outside of their home, or in a facility they later purchased. And by the way, when it says they were at Oxford, like Dilawar Laboratories, Oxford, apparently they were never associated with any university or anything. That was just like the town they were located in. So, and that would make more sense, because I had trouble swallowing the fact that something like this outlandish would be embraced by mainstream science. And boy, a big part of this book is the whole saga of how they continually butted heads with physicians and physicists and the academic institutions, and people would like really buy into it and experiment with it for a while and get really excited about it, and then their colleagues would start putting pressure on them, and all of a sudden all interest would evaporate because people would be worried about losing their careers and things, and kind of thing happened over and over again. So they had a whole bunch of trouble getting this off the ground, and in a way they never really did. But it doesn't stop us from trying it out. The next thing they dealt with was taking pictures, and they found out they could create a machine to photograph energy patterns. So the energy pattern of photographing isn't necessarily a harmonic signature that we're talking about. At least if it is, it's a completely different way of looking at it. But it would relate to it. They would use similar techniques to take these photographs, as odd as it would sound. And when they took the photographs, it would have nothing to do with light. See, this gets back to what Paul Salmon was talking about with photons. This type of energy is apparently closely related enough to light to interact with certain types of photographic film, at least the type these people were using at this time. I'm definitely not certain that this would show up on a CCD of a modern digital camera or something. But at least with the process they were using, they were able to get this energy to register on film. And the object that they were taking the picture of, so to speak, could be anywhere in the world. They just had to be thinking about it. So in a way, it was kind of taking a picture of thought. But they claimed that wasn't exactly what it was doing, and they had all kinds of evidence to support that. And I didn't completely get that the first time around, but apparently well, and in a way it didn't, because like they would take a picture of they would use like a seed of a given type of plant, and then they would think or project like germination or flowering, and what they would get is a picture of the plant that would end up resulting from that seed, but it didn't exist yet. Now, I don't believe they were holding that picture of the plant in their mind, because presumably they'd get the picture of the wrong plant, or the plant would have characteristics that didn't really match that type of seed. And also, presumably in the pictures they saw, there were lots of features that did match up with the plant that they weren't thinking at the time. But again, it's kind of a nebulous issue. The mind of the operator is definitely involved in the process, as well as the mind of the person handling the photographic film and stuff. But they claim that it's not just taking pictures of thought. Which if it was, I mean, that in itself would be flat out miraculous. But and it does definitely seem that they were stumbling on something more akin to Kirlian photography, where you're taking pictures of psychic energy fields or something. Although they don't even mention Kirlian photography once in this book, so I don't know if they were just ignorant of it, or if it didn't relate at all, or what. But I really want to look into these three areas. This area, and the kind of pictures they were taking into Kirlian photography in its traditional sense, and then into the modern work being done by Karakatov, or whatever his name is, with the GDV and stuff, to see what is the same and what is different. It could be that they're all really the same process. One picture I wanted to show you was this one. Now, what this is like a holy relic that was blessed by some religious friend they had or something. And it may have belonged to some saint. I can't really remember what they said. But keep in mind, this is in a chamber like with all the rest of these pictures where there's no light. But here they get a complete exposure of this object with a shadow. And keep in mind, I believe this object it's nowhere near their camera, okay? They're just like using some, I don't know, picture of the guy that blessed it or something as a reference to it, and they get this picture of it registering on their film with a shadow. And they later found out, they basically arrived at the fact that was really important, because the shadow pointed out the fact that there was this stream of energy that was being tapped into. And it's hard for me to describe this in more detail, because I didn't understand it 100% the first time, and probably won't 100% the second time I read through it, but maybe a little more. But what this seems to be getting at is this whole idea that you've got what the sources call basically the love of God, or the essence of God that is permeating the universe continually, which is this endless source of energy that the mind can tap into to create. And it's how all matter is created, because you have the great positive mind of the creator, of God himself, if you will, using this endless source of energy, manipulating it into solid matter. And what they seemed to be photographing here was kind of a stream of the energy and even a shadow it made around this object in a certain sense. I don't know. It's all so freaking crazy. But anyway, so yes, they took pictures. And the pictures could be of the past. Like this guy took I don't know, it was a piece of his wife's skin and his skin, or maybe it was a hair or something, and put them in the chamber, and then thought about their wedding day. And what he got on a picture was the outline of these two figures that looked like a couple standing at the altar or something. And he claims that he wasn't thinking of that specifically. He was just trying to think of their wedding day. And what he's claiming is this is a picture of the past as registered in the essence of those objects. So, and to verify the identity of the two figures, they use their technique where they would take a photograph and see if the photograph was in resonance. Using that machine with the dials, they would see if it was in resonance with the person themselves. And that turned out to be the case. That's who it was. And by the way, they were able to identify people with this, like missing persons. Like you could take a photograph of a missing person and then an aerial photograph of a city, and the location of that person would light up if you have the photographic plate for their camera overlaying the one of the city or something. The point where that person was located would light up on the city map, and you could find out where they were. And apparently they had examples where they did this kind of thing or something. I don't know, just flat out crazy. But so yeah, those were two of the major things. And so basically what they were involved in at the time was developing the science, trying to figure out more and more about how this worked and what was going on, and trying to get funding, which was a continually ongoing battle for them. And then they were dealing with healing, with remote healing and healing illness and stuff using this technique. And it was apparently highly successful, and that's apparently a major use of radionics today, is that type of healing. Not just for people, for plants as well. Apparently there's this whole area of radionics dealing with plants and getting plants to grow better and stuff. And a lot of their research dealt with plants as well, using a lot of the same techniques that related directly to, voila, The Secret Life of Plants book. And they even have mentioned some of the same people. I gotta go back and look, because there was definitely some overlap in the time frames these books were talking about. That'd be interesting, but they're definitely talking about the same kind of research. So this relates directly to the work of Marcel Vogel, imparting energy patterns to crystals, why holy water is holy water, why certain crystals can have healing energy, how you can affect the pattern of growth of a crystal by your thought, and how that can have a lasting effect on the influence of that crystal on healing and things. All of that seems to relate directly to the type of things they're researching in this work, which relates apparently directly to the type of things the readings are talking about. So I think what we're getting here is an overall picture of a science, a step beyond our science, largely because our science turns a deaf ear to anything that relates to ESP or psychic phenomena or ghosts or other dimensions or, well, not other dimensions per se, but in that context, other dimensions. But apparently we'll discover that through legit science as we become more aware of parallel dimensions. That's already a factor in string theory and in quantum mechanics. You talk about, where they talk about the various theories that deal with how the strings work and vibrate and everything, and that has multidimensionality as an integral part of the string theory. It's not a question of are there other dimensions, it's just a question of how many are there in the mind of most of those scientists apparently, and that's in legit science. So I think the idea of parallel dimensions or other dimensions is fairly well accepted, but it's definitely not currently accepted in the context of faith healers or religion or psychic awareness or abilities or anything like that. And so anything that seems to relate to that kind of thing, then of course mainstream science will turn away as, in a way, as the book points out, they have a responsibility. All these institutions and journals and things have a responsibility to filter out the garbage. You can't just have people coming up with whacked out ideas that are based on nothing and say, oh, I think this is how the world works, publish my paper, and then you publish that paper as if it's legit. That's going to really send the wrong message. When something appears in a scientific journal, presumably it's been read and approved by peers that, scientific peers that acknowledge that it's worthwhile research that does make sense and was done in a scientific manner. Now, of course, as part of that process, you're going to also filter out some things that could be legit, but they're just too much at variance with mainstream science. And also, the people involved in them are too poorly versed in the tenets of mainstream science to communicate what they're doing in the terms of modern science. And that's a real pet peeve of mine. One instance here is they get some physician in to look at what they're doing, and they're dealing with a sample of penicillin and trying to show them that they found the rate of vibration of penicillin, and they could just project that to somebody and get a similar effect or something. And one of the things the physician mentioned was, well, it's very apparent from the way you handle the penicillin that you know nothing about it. And he was probably right. And it's not that these guys, therefore, are just full of crap. It's that they were lay people in terms of mainstream science and biological science and things. And that's unfortunate. You know, that relates directly to, there's this lady out there that has this great ability to hear the sonic harmonic signatures, apparently, of sickness and disease and health and things. And she is, in some sense, trying to integrate that with modern science. But look, I don't want to be overcritical here, but I'm using this as an example because I think it's a very important example. You go to her website, you listen to her talk and the videos and things, and for someone that has been schooled in the mainstream science for many years in higher education, at the graduate school level, look, when she's talking about proteomics, molecular biology, biochemistry, even basic chemistry and biology, it becomes apparent in 2 seconds that this lady doesn't have a clue what she's talking about. And that, see, in my mind, that is completely the wrong way to go about this, and that's why this kind of thing will sit here and go nowhere for decades, is because you've got people that don't understand a lot of basic things about mainstream science, which is fine. That's not a problem. The problem is when they don't understand a lot of things about mainstream science, but then they act like they do. And that's exactly what this lady is doing online. You go on her website, and when she talks, when she's interacting with people, she's spouting words out of her mouth that have to do with mainstream science as if she knows what she's talking about. You just listen to her, it's obvious that she doesn't know what she's talking about. And what that does is it robs the whole thing of its ethos. It makes us disrespect the whole thing. It immediately makes the whole thing seem like it's all crap and it's just complete garbage. When in actuality, I'm sure that what she's doing is great. She apparently has some tremendous skills that probably no one else on this planet has at this point, and that they could be used to help people greatly and to really benefit society. But instead, I'm very afraid that because of the tack she's taken, and because of the fact that she's not willing and or able to spend the time it would take to become well-versed in the mainstream science or hook up with somebody who really does and defer to them, because she's unwilling to do that, I think it's basically confining her research, relegating it to a fringe area that is never going to interact with mainstream science, never be accepted, simply because of the manner in which things are portrayed. So, I don't know. I don't like ending a talk on a negative note. I think the positive note is that there are some fantastic people out there like that. What Delaware Laboratories was doing was absolutely fantastic. And sure, what that lady's doing is absolutely fantastic. I think what's needed is people to be open-minded enough to pay attention to what they're doing, but also well-versed enough in mainstream science and still involved in mainstream science enough to get the stuff to the masses through the proper channels, through the accepted channels. because that's how this is going to happen one way or the other. And until those are accepted in the proper channels, they just won't benefit anybody else. They'll just be helpful information that's interesting to some of us. So anyway, until next time,